before we get back into the notes, because we got to get a lot done note-wise today. But before we do that, what does that quote mean? It's a historical quote. Ben Franklin, you know, is one of the founders of America, founding fathers. So what did he mean by this? And can we apply it to today? Any questions or comments? Isaac.
Well, whenever they shut down the country for safety, I know that a lot of people would have rather their freedoms instead of safety that doesn't really protect them half as much.
Everybody understand what he said? Does everybody understand the quote?
Yes.
Some places you'll find the word security instead of safety. You know, over time people muddle what people say, but essentially the quote means this. If you're willing to give up essential liberty, first of all, that's a big word, essential. Like, what's essential liberty? That's debatable, right? But if you're willing to give up liberty to purchase, in other words, to buy yourself some security, some safety, especially temporary safety, then Ben Franklin was telling the people, you don't deserve either one. You don't deserve liberty or safety or security. Now, he wrote this, of course, he's a founding father, so this is 240 years ago, when this great experiment, capital G, capital E, was just being birthed, right? This idea of American freedom, unlike any freedom, any personal liberty the world has ever known. There have been pockets of democracy throughout history that they studied, but to establish what they wanted to establish so that you and I 240 years later can enjoy the freedoms that we have had never been done before. And Franklin was warning people, if you give this up, if you're willing to give this up because you're a little afraid, especially for something temporary, then you don't deserve to even have it. Because he knew it's fragile. And the arc of history tells us that history is full of dictators and tyrants and monarchs. And this idea of personal liberty and freedom was new at that time. And we are the beneficiaries of it, right? How long would people be? How long would we benefit from personal liberty if people are just willing to give it away for trivial reasons? So, any other comments, questions? Because if you give liberty away, it's hard to get back. Just, we've talked about this, I think, before. Human nature. People, power is a big thing. When one group or control can get centralized, it's going to happen. Any other comments, questions? So Isaac said we can relate this to present day America. That the question is, what is essential liberty? To some people it's, you fill in the blank. My body? What? My choice. That's kind of been the mantra for a certain group of people in America for something that they claim they can do to their body, which is not harming their body. They're killing an innocent baby in the womb. But they used that phrase for 50 years, my body, my choice. And now that's kind of been, in some people's eyes, okay, what happened to that when it comes to, is it an essential liberty to determine, Seth gets to determine what he puts in his body? Is that liberty? Or is it the government gets to determine what goes in your body? Is that essential? Is that an important liberty to you, that you decide what you eat, what medicines you take? Is that essential to you? So what's the debate right now? It's becoming bigger and bigger. Can the government decide for you what goes in your body? And if you give up that essential liberty, and Franklin would say you don't deserve liberty at all. Now wait, is there a time where you can give up even an essential liberty for the sake of everybody? Would that be a virtuous thing to do? Is there a time for that? If smallpox was killing 30% of the people that it infected, is that a different argument than a virus that's killing? And by the way, smallpox would kill people that had no prior illnesses. Is that a different argument than a virus that kills less than 1%? And the reason I'm saying less than 1% is I just said about no previous illnesses. So today's current virus, the pandemic that we're living through, has a mortality rate of 1 point something, between 1 and 2, 1.6. But if you are not elderly, obese, diabetic, or already have heart disease, then the virus kills way less than 1% of the people it infects, way less. And that's of the people it infects, not to all the people. So and we've said this last year to you, at your age, this is not, you can look it up if you want, you can try to refute what I'm saying, about to say. At your age, statistically, scientifically, you are in way more danger. Your mortal body is in way more danger getting in the vehicle, whatever it is you got in to come school today. That's just a fact. That's a statistical fact. So you're going to be mandated what to put in your body? For what? What security? What security is even at stake? That's the question of the day. And it's not just, obviously Ben Franklin wasn't prescient enough to know that we're going to be having this pandemic in 2021. So it was a much bigger question for them at the time of the founding. And for most of American history, what has happened the last year and a half? Unthinkable, unfathomable. Except in this generation that we find ourselves in this dilemma, this place of such division politically, because think about it like this. Even if you're on the other side of this argument, I don't know if anybody here is, honestly. Even if you're on the other side of it, if we didn't have people standing up to defend liberty in this case, would there even be what would be the whole idea of having liberty? Does that make sense, that what I just said? Even try to picture you're on the other side, if you're not. I don't know where you're at. Let's say I'm a person that says, this is serious, there's people dying, everybody's got to get vaccinated. That's it. Freedom doesn't matter. Let's say I'm president of the United States. It's not about freedom. That's what I just did there. Well, that's what he said. So this is the American president saying it's not about freedom. Anyway, now I got myself off track. Let's say you're that person. You're saying everybody's got to be vaccinated. If you're American or you believe in personal liberty or individual freedom at all, and you're okay with no one protesting, standing up against it, think about what that means. That if you had your way and there was no one going against it, so no one's standing up for freedom, where does that lead us? Especially when it comes to someone mandating what can be put in your body, especially when, if you talk about liberty and security, you're talking about something that we really, truly, I don't care what side of the argument you're lying if you say you truly know. We really, truly don't know not even the short term, let alone long term effects. Your chances of contracting the virus, very low. Your chances of being harmed by the virus, lower. Your chances of dying of the virus, and almost nil, your age. Your chances of being harmed by the vaccine seem to be very low. But do we know? That's the question. And how much liberty are we willing to give away? All right, because you don't get it back. It doesn't work like that. Well, we got a lot of notes to do, Jamin, unless you have more comments, questions. Because the reason I put quotes and things to start the day is not for me to dominate the talk, but for you to have comments. Noel, got anything for me? Any thoughts? No? Anybody else? All right, let's continue. As we continue, what we're doing here at the beginning of the year, Riley, is Mr. Franken had to endeavor on almost an impossible task. Up until this year, U.S. history at the high school level has kind of been split into two. One was pre-Civil War and the other was post-Civil War. Well, this year, it's been changed. This happens a lot in education, but in my case, I've had to condense, my job this year is to primarily teach post-Civil War history, which I'm perfectly happy with. But I couldn't convince myself to just totally blow off the founding of the country. So I've had to try to condense from early exploration, Columbus, to the Civil War, and I'm trying to get it done in less than a month. So if you're looking at these notes and things seem like shorthand or really condensed, that's the way it is. Like, for instance, today, we're going to have one slide that covers the whole French and Indian War. We could spend weeks on the French and Indian War itself, right? But it's going to be in one slide. So here we go. I know you can't wait to get to these notes. Oh. All right, here's where we left off. Right, you guys watch Muhlenberg and the Black Robe Regiment? That leads us to the mid-1700s. This is what this land looked like, North America, in the middle of the 1700s during the Great Awakening. The blue is France. France, as you can see, claimed much more territory in North America than the red, which is Great Britain. What do you remember from your study of American history in the past, from elementary and middle school and even last year? Were the French more or less concerned about settlement? Less. So it appears that they've got way more territory, therefore they'd be way more powerful, right? But it's not necessarily the case, because as you might remember, the American colonies were kind of limited by, they went from the Atlantic Ocean to what prominent geographic? The Appalachian Mountains, right? And there was very little movement beyond the Appalachians. The French came down from the north to the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and they started to go into this territory and had developed closer relationships with the Native Americans. They developed a lot of trade relations, and their idea was, hey, let's just get what we can and take it back to Europe and get rich. Where the English, that was at first their thought, and they decided, you know what, we're more interested in, we're going to settle this land than the French were. So the French look like they're dominating, but in reality, there's more British here than French, even though the territory's like that, right? And then the tan or orangish color, that's for Spain. And of course, if we went down into Central and South America, Spain would cover much more. That would be all of Spanish territory, right? Well, that's the map before the French and Indian War. So here's the French and Indian War in one slide. The French and Indian War was fought from 54 to 63, except it's more complicated. It was only fought in America from 54 to 60, and it was only fought in Europe from 56 to 63. So therefore, it got the nickname in Europe, not the French and Indian War, but the 7 Years' War. It started here, ended earlier here, but it lasted for 7 years in Europe. Called the 7 Years' War because, every time Britain and France went into war against each other. They had come up with a name for that war. This is a fancy name for a war, huh? Oh, it lasted 7 years, so we'll call it the 7 Years' War. It wasn't the first time that France and England were at war with each other. But it was the first time their war started outside of Europe, because now they're both looking for victory in the colonies or in the New World. Here we're introduced to this guy right here, the great George Washington, the inimitable. Ooh, that's a big word, Elise. Inimitable. What does that mean? Can you spell it?
No.
The inimitable George Washington. That means you can't imitate him. Inimitable means it's someone you can't duplicate. There never has been, never will be another person quite like George Washington. Again, founder of our country, the father of our country, the great military hero, the leader of the colonial army that defeated the greatest army in the world at that time, the impossible task of defeating the British Army with a bunch of farmers and merchants that weren't even soldiers in the first place, and to forge them into a fighting force that can beat the greatest army on earth. George Washington did that. Oh, by the way, speaking of early American history and the foundation, some people would try to tell you that George Washington wasn't Christian, and I'm not arguing that he was. They'll try to say he was a deist. He believed in a God, but not Christ in the Bible. However, even if that was true, to further enhance the claim that America was founded on Christian principles and biblical principles, even if you say to someone, they try, oh no, and they try to rattle off Ben Franklin, George Washington, and they try to say that they weren't Christians, they all had this idea. George Washington said, it is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God and the Bible. This nation that they were trying to institute, that they were trying to form, this republic, they knew it couldn't happen. They knew it wouldn't work without people that first and foremost followed the God of the Bible. Because in order to self-govern, it takes a people that are willing to have self-control, to follow. You know, if you're not willing to follow Almighty God Himself, how willing are you going to be to create a society where you're given freedom, not lorded over by a king or a tyrant, and be able to be responsible enough to handle it? To have the self-control and the civic mind that says, hey, we can live in peace with each other and prosper together even without someone making us do it. Anyway, that's where, not General, but Lieutenant Colonel Washington is a big factor in the French and Indian War, because, I'm going to try to make sense of this as you're writing these notes. I'm admitting, without going everything about it, it's going to be hard to make it all make sense. But again, remember the journey that we're on here, what we're trying to accomplish. But Washington sets up a fort outside of what we would call today Pittsburgh. Well, that's on the other side that's on our side of the Appalachians, right? That's quote unquote French territory. Washington is a British general, lieutenant colonel. So there's a dispute around Pittsburgh. Anybody know that there's a university around Pittsburgh called Duquesne? You heard of that? So he sets up a fort there as a challenge to the French dominance. And that's going to lead to war. Okay, so now there's a war between the French and the English, west of the Appalachians. It's not going so well for the British. One of the highlights is, the turning points I should say, is in 1757, a man named William Pitt becomes prime minister in Great Britain. So like in our neck of the woods, in our region of the world, in our region of the country, even though we're in a different state, we're only 45, 50 miles as the bird crow flies from Pittsburgh. So now we know where Pittsburgh got its name, right? William Pitt became prime minister in 1757 in the midst of this war, and it wasn't going so well. So he instituted a plan called Pitt's Plan to, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're fighting we're fighting the French in Europe, and we have allies in Europe helping us fight that fight. Namely, a group called the Prussians. They're not Russians. They're more Germanic. We have a group called the Prussians that are helping us. We've got other. What's really necessary is that we win this battle over there in the New World. So we're gonna leave the battle in Europe up to the Prussians, and we're gonna focus more of our attention on beating the French in the New World. And one of the ways we're going to do it is we're going to fire those rotten commanders that have been leading this war so badly, and we're going to bring in new commanders. We're going to send new commanders, and one of them was our own James. No, but there's a new student in the school this year named James Wolfe. But one of those was James Wolfe, who becomes a great military leader for the British in the French and Indian War. Everybody got all that? Questions, comments? Well, the war's over. Look at that. We had the beginning of the war with Fort Necessity being built. We have the turning point in the war, William Pitt instituting a new plan. And obviously the tide did turn. The English turned the battle around, turned the war around, and they defeated the French, which leads to the treaty that ends wars. This one was in Paris. And that map you just saw before we got into this, where it was mostly blue, west of the Appalachians, is going to turn red. Because the British are going to gain all of the territory and what we now call America from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. In the negotiations, Spain loses Florida, but they gain. There were politics going on between England, France, and Spain. In this treaty, Spain loses Florida, so that's going to become part of British territory, but they're going to gain Louisiana. A couple more things on this slide. The war actually ends here in what we call America 3 years before it ends in Europe. Again, it's called the 7 Years' War because it was fought from 56 to 63 in Europe. By the way, side question. In history, who calls it the French and Indian War? The British do, because they were fighting against the French and the Indians, right? French wouldn't call it that. So we call it that in America because our English foundation is English. And what was the two things I said that we were doing all of this first 2 weeks of study about? We're doing all of this study of history to figure out why we are, one, English, and two, Protestant. Because guess what? Is France a Protestant or Catholic nation at this time? In fact, I think you could still say that France is a Catholic, by and large, Catholic country today. The French win. If the French had won, think about this, if the French had won, then Catholicism would have been the dominant religion in this new world, right? If the French had won, the Catholic Church would have remained more dominant. By the way, don't read into that I think that would necessarily be like some really bad thing. I didn't say that. I did not say that. I just said that would be what happened, right? And we know that what was going on between Catholicism and Protestantism as a result of the Reformation is still going on, and there could have been persecution. By the way, I forgot this. This is probably bugging you, huh? Noelle Crowther's mom or grandma is thankfully one of many people around the country that are kind of like, hey, we got to take more ownership of our democracy. And there's all kinds of groups like this forming around the country where just we ordinary lay people, citizens, are like, we can't just stay here asleep while all these things are happening. And then we complain to each other. So there's groups forming like this one where they get together once a month or a couple times a month and they talk about, hey, we got to educate ourselves on what's going on, what we can do. You know, the country's built on government has power by the consent of the governed, right? That's kind of been turned on its head in the last 50 years. So how do we educate each other? How do we affirm each other? How do we build each other up to try to keep what America's promise has always been? All right, that's the French and Indian War. And now, here's the new map. This, on the other one, was all blue. And now it's tan, because it's Spanish territory. I'm sorry. This, on the other one, it was all blue. And here it's tan, it's French. The colonies went from the coast to the Appalachians, coast all the way to the Mississippi. That's all British territory now. And this isn't French anymore, it's Spain's. And when we say Louisiana, we don't mean this piece of land right here, only this big. We mean all of this territory becomes under the control of the King of Spain. By the way, I thought I heard just one little blurb. Is there another tropical storm / hurricane forming headed for Louisiana? Anybody hear that? I thought I heard something like that this morning. That wouldn't be good. I have family of cousins, so there's 4 of them down there. One of them, when was Ida? Wasn't that at the end of August? It's been at least 3 weeks, right? Almost 4. One of my cousins has power. Almost a month later. They were right in the path. The eye of the storm went just west of New Orleans. One of my cousins lives in a place called Houma. A couple others live in a place called Thibodaux, and the other one's like somewhere around those 2 areas. The eye went right over them. One of them has power restored. Last week, the heat index was over 100. So if you don't have any power, you don't have any air conditioning. Whew. My immediate family, my dad, my brother, and a couple of my aunts, we're supposed to go down there. It's been planned for a long time, next Monday. Now they can't go because they don't think they're going to have power by next week. So it seemed like, hey, that storm came and went, and we've forgotten all about it. There are people still down there trying to clean up and restore power. It was a much bigger hurricane than kind of the news made it out to be, right? It wasn't as big as, what's the most famous hurricane you know of? And you're like, go ahead, who said it? Say it out loud. Katrina, right? That's the one that, because it was bigger, it was technically more powerful, it caused more damage in New Orleans itself, right? But this hurricane, this is what they were telling me at the time. My cousins were like, they've never experienced this hurricane. The difference was it was not as powerful, it was not as big as Katrina, but it maintained its strength longer. Does that make sense? They had never experienced a hurricane that by the time it got to them, because they're more inland, was still that strong, and that it stayed strong for like 12 hours. It was still like a category 3, 12 hours after it had made landfall. Usually they diminish rapidly. So that's why they're still cleaning up and they don't have power almost a month later. Now we're going to do the Boston Tea Party and get ready for the revolution in the next 5 minutes. I admit these notes are really jumbled because I'm trying to just fit a lot of information in there. Also, as you're writing, you know that there was more than just a tax on tea, right? Can you give me another tax that the colonists were faced with in the 1760s and 70s? Just name one. You can remember one. Go ahead.
Playing cards.
Playing cards? Was that part of the Stamp Act or no? Yeah. So the Stamp Act, even down to like your playing cards. What else? Anybody remember any other acts of Parliament that were putting taxes on commerce in the colonies? Sugar Act, Stamp Act. The declaration that you read to start the year, right? You didn't just answer the questions, you read it, right? Riley, by the way, when you get a chance, I know it seems cumbersome, but what did it take? 10, 15 minutes to read the declaration. It's one of the things we did to start the year. And all of those grievances, because of all the taxes, and by the way, one of the major things was the colonists were going through all this taxation without representation. Remember that phrase? Okay, well anyway, the Tea Act is one of those acts that was met with, and this really wasn't violent, but with an quote-unquote insurrection action, a rebellious action by the patriots that said, we've had enough. In fact, some of the British ships wouldn't even go into port because of previous ships being attacked or threatened to be attacked by the colonists because they just had enough. They've had enough of all these acts of Parliament without their consent, just driving up their taxes, even if the taxes weren't that big. It says it's kind of a small tax, but that's not the point. It was the principle of it. Well, in November of 1773, a British ship called the Dartmouth, does come into port with a lot of tea. Even though there was these threats of not coming into port. And a little more than 2 weeks later, on December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans went on board the Dartmouth screaming, among other things, Boston Harbor is going to be a teapot tonight. And they threw 342 cases of tea into the harbor. And the reason it says clean operation is because they got on the boat, they threw out the tea, no one was killed. I think there were reports they even kind of cleaned up after themselves when they were done. But the point was made. And by the way, guess who got the message? Loud and clear. Who's the big guy? Who was on the throne in England in the 1770s? King. Somebody's whispering out there, afraid to say it. Did you say George? George the First? George the Second? George the Third? Maybe? Yes. King George the Third tells the Prime Minister of England at that time, that's it. These colonists are either going to submit or they're going to have to be defeated. colonists must submit or triumph. If they think they're going to challenge us this way, well, we have reached a point really almost of no return. You get the message to the colonists, Prime Minister North, that they either submit to us or they're going to have to fight us. And guess what? Colonists agree. And the war is about to start, which I guess we can't do till tomorrow. So believe it or not, I'm going to endeavor to cover the whole Revolutionary War tomorrow. Give you the major highlights. If you looked at RenWeb, I optimistically, better to be safe than sorry. The test isn't going to be Thursday. There's no way. But at least you got it on your mind, there's a test coming up. No problems, no buts. Have a weekend. For a weekend, huh? Oh, did you have a new group? Wow, cool. The whole thing? Because in understanding time, we mostly focus on the first one.
That's why Joe Biden impression. Hey, what? You guys like Joe Biden impression? You get it? It's funny. Oh.
What?
Oh, yeah.
I gotta get that out though, Maddie.
I love
5 minute nap.
Federalism, individual rights. What is that? That ow.
It was given to me by just recently.
I don't
Welcome to pre-algebra. Third week. About to commence.
have